My essay in the new issue of Mal is called Incel Protocols, which refers to the design mechanics and platform spaces where incels formed. I'm assuming everyone is familiar with the incel phenomenon, but it also refers to the uses that we put this idea of incels to in kind of mainstream or normie culture, like however you want to refer to that. You've probably heard people using it as kind of a fun slur in the last year or two. And then finally, I wanted the Incel Protocols title refers to the kind of life we've all been living this year, where we've had to have a little sample of what it might mean if we were to try and manifest our sociality exclusively using platforms that were built and designed in California. It's not easy. Okay, so I'm going to read now, and hopefully it'll work next time. I'm very sorry for the breakdown before. There's a film about sex dolls I've had the misfortune of seeing twice. At Chisenhale Gallery in London and the KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin, I stumbled across Danish artist Sidsel Meineke Hansen's short video about Bordel, a brothel in Western Germany where clients can pay 80 euros an hour to have sex with mannequins. In one unforgettable scene, a cleaner there compares her job to previous work in a care home, to institutions that exist, she says, to take away anxiety. Watching as she sluices and disinfects the orifices of a cartoonishly imagined silicone doll, the viewer is possessed not by arousal, but by a unique variety of horror. It's like encountering pornography too young, only now the fallen veil masking human biology is compounded by the sickness of the uncanny valley, a semi-conscious fear that the machine might realize what is happening to her. The name of Hansen's film is Maintenancer, a play on necromancer, from the Latin term for someone who communes with the dead. Etymology can often feel like a superficial way to drill into a concept, but in the case of incels, a portmanteau for involuntary celibate, the implications of the word have not yet fully been thrashed out. In 1993, a Canadian graduate student named Alana Boltwood set up a simple HTML webpage under the heading Alana's Involuntary Celibacy Project. She posted a list of possible definitions for imcel or incel, not limited to gender, sexual preference, or even marital status, the most straightforward of which was the state of being sexually inactive while wishing to be otherwise. The ultimate object of her study was loneliness, why it seemed to be growing in the West, and how this intersected with sex. Before the end of the decade, Boltwood gave up the site. She didn't think too much more about it until Elliot Rodger murdered 6 people and injured 14 in Isla Vista, California in May 2014. In the intervening years, something significant had changed. Throughout his 107,000-word memoir manifesto, My Twisted World, Elliot Rodger conceives of his virginity as a market failure. Rodger was the son of British filmmaker Peter Rodger, who made a documentary about the nature of God in 2009 and was second unit director on The Hunger Games. His grandfather was Georges Rodger, a founding member, along with Henri Cartier-Bresson of Magnum Photos, whose images from Bergen-Belsen at the end of World War II were syndicated and reproduced around the globe, but left the photographer traumatized. A child of immense privilege, Elliot Rodger regularly calculates his assets: exotic holidays, a private education, designer shoes, cars, and Gucci sunglasses, then concludes that it mustn't be enough. I wanted to be a millionaire, he writes, so I could live a luxurious life and finally be able to attract the girls I covet. As the writer Mike Crumpler succinctly puts it in a close reading of the manifesto, Elliot is the human personification of the McMansion ideology. Yet there is more than just a logic of capitalist exchange in play in the world of incels. There is a coding logic too. To exist on the modern internet is to participate in the expansion and refinement of a planetary scale data set. To prove you're not a robot, you help educate a robot, describing pictorial elements and analyzing a thread of hard-to-read text in order to program a neural network. In turn, by conditioning your behavior, the network programs you. It's no accident that identity politics seem to abandon the demand for material improvement in favor of greater representation, most obviously in business, politics, and the arts, at a time when millions of new users were signing up to platforms that required demographic identification as a condition of entry. The first step in joining any website of the generation known loosely as Web 2.0 is to click a drop-down box and identify yourself. The second is to develop a profile. It was this set of technologies that separated the lonely incels of Alana Boltwood's celibacy project from the swarms of shitposters associated with the R9K board on 4chan, an integral juncture in the arrival of the so-called manosphere. The first Web 2.0 summit was held in San Francisco in 2004. Captains of industry, including Yahoo's Jerry Yang and Amazon's Jeff Bezos, convened alongside bloggers, entrepreneurs, and venture capitalists to discuss an emerging paradigm of internet engagement. In their opening remarks, conference organizers Georges Bataille and Tim O'Reilly explained that on the participatory or social web, customers are building your business for you. They outlined a future where web-based applications would enable users to upload text, images, videos, and other content to microblogs and wikis, forming an architecture of participation that was, in essence, the birth of the attention economy. In this new world, tags would string together thematically related concepts from distant corners of the web. Linguistic folksonomies would produce semantic clouds to improve ad targeting, and users would be encouraged by easy-to-use, rich web environments and clean, uncluttered aesthetics to more fully express themselves online. Instead of building a static HTML site, as Boltwood did, users would generate content on privately owned digital real estate, where it would compete for ratings or reviews. By the start of the 2010s, the unintended repercussions of this development were already becoming clear. The number of users on Facebook exploded with the introduction of a like function, a psychologically irresistible trigger for amplification absorbed from competitor friend feed, which Facebook acquired in 2009. The approval matrix gamified interactivity, and rival platforms rushed in to develop comparable instruments, the upvote associated with image boards like Reddit, or the repost functions integral to Tumblr or Twitter. These machines pitted avatars in competition against each other to produce the most attention-worthy content. Anything from a culturally encoded pictograph, that is to say, a meme, or a personal story of abuse weaponized for traction in the online space. Targets set by investors in Silicon Valley demanded network effects and greater time on device, unleashing new forms of violent sentiment in the process. Safety features and terms of service rewritten ad nauseum was never more than a distraction from the baked-in priorities of the social media business model. When black-boxed algorithms order our feeds, it will always be the loudest, most provocative content that rises to the top. For those whose media remained unidirectional, like radio, TV, or print, journalists' reports from this simulated reality seemed totally unhinged. Whether it was the dogpile misogyny of Gamergate, memorial pages for dead teens being desecrated on Facebook, or the doxing of victims of sexual assault, mainstream news coverage would report outrageous statements or acts they'd uncovered online, but did much less to investigate the conditions out of which they emerged. As celebrities, politicians, the alt-right, junior academics, and media class careerists engaged in peer-to-peer confrontations and linguistic flame wars online, social mobility went into reverse. Wages stagnated, productivity and innovation flatlined, and life expectancy declined in the West. It's not that the simulation isn't real life, it definitely is, but it's a corner of reality defined by specific affordances, incentives, and limitations, defined by opaque corporations who use symbols of togetherness, hearts, thumbs up, speech bubbles, and empathetic language, community, friends, sharing, to disguise a momentous recalibration of precisely those things. Inceldom formed in this environment and is imprinted by its behavioral mechanisms. It's not the origin of the darkness, but it is the CPU through which it flows. Part of the allure of smartphones is their ability to mediate uncomfortable emotional states, to provide respite, distraction, or relief from boredom, embarrassment, or fear, developed by engineers who have often been schooled in the hacker mindset to seek out vulnerabilities and mine them for access. The Matrix welcomes us at our most embittered. and confirms our worst suspicions about the world. In the case of incels, many of whom are teenagers, it captures the excoriating, adrenaline-soaked misery of perceived or real rejection, then freezes it in technostasis by codifying it and refusing to allow those emotions to crest and recede. Finding your echo chamber is a disaster for solidarity, locating commonalities across difference and building towards mutually beneficial ends, but it's even worse for treatment and recovery. Life as a sexual being can feel like torture, a reminder of one's inadequacy and inability to find contentment. There can be relief in opening up about the perverse and unspeakable ways desperation manifests, from suicidal ideation to having sex with silicone mannequins in a drab hotel in Dortmund. It's a cliche to say that the limits of compassion are tested not by those who provoke our sympathy, but by those who don't. And yet the talking cure, rehabilitation, every kind of witness, these are among the healing strategies built up by humans over time. These are outgrowths of friendship and true community, by which I mean unmediated by corporations with the necessity of turning a profit at their core. Our contemporary moment is one that turns all care and struggle inward, privatizes it, pathologizes it, and disregards it as a chemical imbalance in order to knock up medical or technical solutions, while enclosing all spaces, both physical and digital, for truly free expression and the diagnosis of graver ills. The word incel is regularly partnered with a second word, community. But if incels are a community, then the software and CEOs that made them are a part of that community too, a part with a far greater voting share. It's not in their interests for anyone to log off. Thank you.
Awesome. So my name is Lara Mimosa Montes. I'm in the USA right now, Brooklyn Center. Very happy that you're joining us. Um, Thanks for bearing with us. The Zoom world is an adventure, and I'm really glad to share poems. I'm excited because Mal is like a really beautiful journal, and I am excited for the poems to be, yeah, in the world. And I'm excited to also like use the opportunity to read old work that is like mm, um a little more erotic than some of my new stuff. So let me start with an older poem that I was thinking about today, on this matter of sex negative. Um, I I was thinking about a Butoh class that I took years ago, and something that the Butoh class teacher said was, be thankful to those who have hurt you because they too are part of whatever journey has brought you here. And I've been like thinking about this for years, and I left it in my poem so I could like return to it. Um, but yeah, it's resonating. I said I was not going to send a signal flare, but I did. Upon reading some petty internet poetry criticism where I was misgendered by another, ugh, who cares? It's of little consequence the shape of the fig leaf, the kink of the hair. And not to talk shit, but she was one of those self-righteous, light-skinned femmes, as was I once. Now I just dance, though I lack grace, plus a coherent sense of what I am. In Butoh class, teacher said during meditation, be thankful to those who have hurt you because they too are part of whatever journey has brought you here. Sure, okay. The one time I saw Marina Amabrovich, I was on a very bad first date. Within a few days, an acquaintance known only to me as Teddy posted a photo of himself from that same day. I later recognized this exact photo on the Museum of Modern Art's webpage, for the artist is present. In it, Teddy's face appears notably frustrated, pained, inelegant, and cliche, a hallmark of a lot of good performance art. Inside the spectacle that is the museum, I contemplate not grace, but a relatively benign blue-green shape, while imagining the various ways a body can, in spite of social convention, articulate what feels both transgressive and deliriously commonplace. Be thankful to those who have hurt you, because they too are part of whatever journey has brought you here. That was like years ago, but it's still resonating in my fascia, in my face, in my like genitourinary area. Manuela. A rabbit went through a hole in the fence and decided it's time for a thought hiatus. Ours was not a wedding I expected to end in a marriage, but when he spoke of the future, Manuela remained silent, and that silence was like light bouncing off of a lunar object. That part of me you broke with your echinoderm hands, always perceiving past the surface. Manuela felt her own hands tighten. She did not emerge from her hiatus a shadow, thoughtless, nor did she return to earth a rabbit. What if there was a part of us that neither you or I could retrieve? She asked her husband, as she began to recall the dream of the unmade bed before resolving yes. That too is private. Manuela was working out a truth-making process, the part of us that does not survive the violence. I wrote that the week that George Floyd had been murdered in Minneapolis by the police. Violence was on my mind, and that's how I was relating to it. This next poem was written after the artist Carol Rama, who's back in people's attention spheres. If you don't know Carol Rama's work, I invite you to seek it out. It's so, I think of tongues and like lasciviousness. I studied in the museum an erogenous form, and then at home I studied my own zinc, rubber, flesh, and core. When I think about your body and yours, I know I am held by the roseate swarm, and were I a matador, I might, in facing the bull, finally face myself. But what if a whole is not an absence so much as it is a space one reserves? Space without time, space even more than time. Try to recognize the dotted lines as I divine one shape. Will it speak or will it swerve? I'm going to read a short section from my book, Thresholds. Let's see. This is like a, yes, there we go. You can buy it from Coffee House Press or from your local bookseller. Make a request. Just came out this past May. Also, a meditation on violence, silence, and shame. So I took the opportunity to write about my favorite film about sex or sex addiction, Shame. Directed by Steve McQueen. Steve McQueen's feature Shame, starring Michael Fassbender opposite Carey Mulligan, is often described as a portrait of a man struggling with sex addiction, though I have never been entirely convinced. It's not that the film isn't about that. McQueen describes in countless interviews following the film's release that in order to write the screenplay, he and his co-author Abby Morgan traveled to the US to interview self-confessed sex addicts. It's just that to frame the film's events or the characters' actions, particularly Brandon Sullivan's, around this fact feels so inadequate, as though the sex part of sex addiction overshadowed the no less dramatic aspects of addiction: obsession, ruin, withdrawal, depression, obsession, ruin, repetition, relapse. We're not bad people, we just come from a bad place. These the words spoken by the character Sissy, played by Carey Mulligan, to her brother Brandon. aka Michael Fassbender, allude to the life before the movie. It's the closest the characters ever get to facing the specter that is the knowledge-producing event. In other words, something happened to these people, but we are never privy to the particulars of what constitutes the bad place to which Sissy refers. And yet we can imagine the characters' actions throughout the film allow us to speculate. In a movie filled with tense moments, this intimate confrontation between brother and sister is no less so. The knowledge of the bad place, a knowing that Brandon and Sissy share, keeps them bound to one another in ways that surpass my capacity to speak of it. Perhaps because I do not have a brother, or more likely because I loved and was loved by someone in an unremarkable way, and not always the right way. After I would say often he felt like my brother, probably because we shared a certain kind of knowing. It shall not be spoken of here. And I'll read one more. I think that keeps me in time, right? I'm excited to hear the other reader, so I don't want to take up too much space, but this has been fun. Let's see. I'm going to read one that's from maybe some people don't like preface about poems, but I like the opportunity to share, and talk. I don't know. Maybe that makes me like American. The school year is coming up, and this is sort of in the style of the classroom and the piano teacher. A blowjob titled Givenchy. Salope, idiot, pig, slut, a blonde Alain Delon seats himself before me 2 rows from the front. It's September 2 years ago now, but I know from the first day, I know just to see him walking in, I'm going to get this kid. And not only am I going to get him, but I'm going to get him to take it from me too, and to take it from the front. I knew it like I knew that it was always going to be him and his blue eyes trotting across the page for me, slowly at first, but willingly, so that eventually, ideally, one need not even call him by his own straight name. But if he's good, I'll give him a heteronym. Yes, if he's good, he'll get a hetero name, something straight, like Billy Name. I'm going to get him so good and trained. Face-moi, and he'll face me because he's good, my best, blue eyes trotting, up and down, ahem, like a seam ripper. So I stick my hands in and run my 2 fingers along his teeth's edge as if his mouth were a seam. 2 hands, 1 seam, one that sits on the back of a woman's leg, cutting her calf in half and cutting it hard. Except it's not hard, to my surprise, when I finally run my hands down his crotch seam. It's not hard sliding my hand in either, if he's facing me, if it's 4:30 a.m., if we're on the corner of West 4th and Broadway, a block away from his apartment, if he wants it, and he wants it. If not, he'll learn to open his big, huge Barbie mouth for me and say, ah, ah. Thanks. I'm gonna pass it over to the next reader. Looking forward, and Mal.
Hi, I'm going to jump straight in and read a compressed version of my essay Collective Turnoff for issue 5 of Mal. I think human beings are turned off right now. Of course, it is tempting to rationalize our turned offness with reference to COVID-19, but it can not ever be the teeming, vaporous, germinating nature of one another's bodies that shuts down our erotic appetites. To love sex is necessarily to enjoy cross-contaminations of human flesh. It is to throw one's all, for that reason, into the collective tenderness of social distancing, the techniques of covering and disinfecting, the intimate care of masking up and wiping down that is required to keep one another well, and the open air spaces, piers, fields, quays, docks, woods, where fucking flourished before gentrification, remain the spaces where it would be safest to fuck today, if only we wanted to. No, the truth is that we are too overworked under capitalism to be deeply, collectively horny. too overworked even to realize that this is the case. In 1987, Douglas Crimp published How to Have Promiscuity in an Epidemic, the epidemic in question being, of course, not COVID, but a different spikily haloed virus, AIDS. The essay expresses the wisdom, epidemiological expertise, and hard-fought shamelessness of the countless militant lesbians and gays who refused to be blackmailed by the state into monogamy, abstinence, or a work ethic, and who invented safe sex as the bedrock of their promiscuous culture long before AIDS. Sexual freedom used to be a central problem of anti-capitalist thought and practice. As Carol Vance put it in the preface to the infamous 1982 Pleasure and Danger anthology, for women, and I would add queers, quote, to experience autonomous desire and act in ways that give them sexual pleasure in a society that would nurture and protect their delights is our culture's worst nightmare and feminism's best fantasy. But this kind of sex positivity, this stance of optimism, confident that the admittedly risky pursuit of bodily vulnerability might help transform the species and remake humanity, that is utterly out of vogue, both on the scholarly left and in culture at large. And it isn't difficult to see why. Many heterosexual women, deep in the mass grieving process that attends the movement known as Me Too, are sick to death of heterosexual and indeed just sexual optimism. Right now, even when they publish ostensibly optimistic books about how, for example, women have better sex under socialism, female leftists sometimes seem unable to envision outright good sex, indeed unable to dream up anything better than simply an absence of domestic abuse. Make no mistake, this stern realism, this grim anti-utopianism about what sex with men is and implicitly always will be, is nothing if not understandable. The discursive ultra-misandry that was so popular on social media circa 2014, remember #KillAllMen, is happily out of fashion. But the anger at men underlying it, which by the way was never ironic, has had no material reason to dissipate. With men like Trump and Brett Kavanaugh in the highest offices of the US government and judiciary, women of all classes right now are righteously filled with rage, disappointment, betrayal, and disgust. Nevertheless, the reason that sharing life with men feels like slow violence is ultimately not the men themselves, not in many cases anyway. But rather, it's the hierarchies that, flowing through us all, elevate them and suffocate us. The repudiation of sleeping with the enemy, enacted by some feminists in the 1970s, was and remains widely and rightly derided. Rarely, however, do contemporary feminists acknowledge that a lot of sex is experienced as making a gift of oneself to one's oppressor, despite how nice and love-worthy the guy in question is or isn't. Rarely do we talk about political lesbianism as a poor strategy founded on a factual, albeit dramatic, assessment of heterosex under patriarchy as perilous for women's spiritual health. Even more rarely do we seem to grasp that the opposite position, the position of the sexual liberationists, shared that same assessment. Only the utopian horizon of post-gender pleasure, in their eyes, made the perils of having sex in the present worth confronting. There are, today, as Lauren Berlant commented recently, many new sex-negative feminists cropping up in our present moment, people who are, quote, incompetent about even their own desire. Whether we are feminist or anti-feminist, many of us are so exhausted, coerced, and alienated by capitalism's work/enjoyment culture that we don't know how to have really good sex, be it with men or plants or ourselves or the top side of a washing machine. It bears repeating that much of the sex-negative appraisal of the conjuncture is correct. Capitalist society is centrally predicated on commanding us all, but women especially, to unrepress ourselves, to talk about sex constantly as though confessing something innate, and always and ever to enjoy. It's the next step in the chain of logic that is missing, the observation that this stressful, pressurized prurience isn't remotely conducive to actual, guards-down, polymorphous experimentation. This great sex experience that the market commands every optimized, self-managed subject to be consuming isn't good sex. Yes, porn is now precisely taxonomized and accessible. Hooking up is algorithmically managed. Being horny on main has gained acceptability. Yet desire seems elusive. Saying, I would prefer not to, in rejection of this prescribed, coerced regime of sexuality, need not necessarily be a rejection of sexuality per se, although, of course, it can be, and all power to the asexuals. Arguably, I would prefer not to is the most crucial ground zero ingredient of good sex. But today, in popular feminism, the unfruitfulness of the androcide and exodus positions has given way not to a revival of the communist dream of sexual liberation, but to a widespread stance of misandry light, characterized by martyred resignation to the dismal quality of heterosex. Indiana Sarazin's viral article about performative anti-heterosexualism provides crucial contexts for this. The cultural trend the essay pinpoints is, of course, heterofatalism. Simply put, the heterofatalist subject, who is typically situated within a young, white, cis female demographic, is a straight one who disavows straightness. Her professing of a helpless, empty wish to be a lesbian is certainly part of it. But the main trait of these women, says Indiana, is their emphasis, quote, that they are not that kind of heterosexual, that they are in fact ashamed of being straight, and that, not to be dramatic, they see heterosexuality as a prison within which they are confined against their will, unquote. The point here is not that heterofatalists' gestures of disaffiliation are insincere, rather that they are performative because unaccompanied by collective experiments in abandoning or even talking heterosexuality. Yet their resignation is all the stranger and all the more depressing when one considers the rationality, the correctness of complaining about heterosexual life, the gravity of many of these claims that allegedly wannabe queer women might marshal in indictment of heterosexual relations. It's a risky move, as Indiana Sarazin well knows, to pinpoint in comic paraphrases the arrogation of delighted victimhood that lies at the heart of this straight girl, straightness fatalism, in a world in which straightness for females can so often be literally fatal. Yet, the diagnosis clears vital ground for what can and will hopefully become a conversation about the all too real feelings of dysphoric horror and defensive nihilism many women feel upon learning the scripts of heterosexualism, often feeling them to be embedded in their muscles, and surveying the grimness of the dating culture in which, accordingly, their personal tastes dictate they participate. While that conversation is beginning to happen, the heterofatalist posture is still serving as yet another method by which white women like me can project outward our own cowardice and machismo. That is to say, our own aversion to vulnerability. By rehearsing the view that men are the worst while continuing to pursue romantic and sexual attachments with them, we perform an othering gesture that shores up the purity or innocence of our own identities. We may love men, we declare, but we barely enjoy it, okay? We are embarrassed. We are not contaminated by them. We are not they. In other words, we get to continue to be women. Perhaps, semi-unconsciously, we had worried that the very category of women had become untenable. If we can only continue to reproduce the category men loudly enough, then we wager the category women might stay safe. By being unhappily straight, those of us who are not men are off the hook for our complicities with men. We are off the hook for the many women who become men, the men who become women, and the many people more who are simply neither or both. For the fact that, to quote Sophia Giovannitti, gender is never fixed, gender is always broken. Worse, we are off the hook for creating deep care and nourishment for ourselves and others within the world as we find it. We are collectively turned off, in my assessment. And part of us does not want this to change, because were it to change, we wouldn't get to be women anymore in the classic sense of wishing collectively that we were turned on. To radically transform heterosexuality, in contrast, might begin, as Sarrazin says, with honest accounts of which elements of heterosexuality are actually appealing. I feel encouraged by the call for a politically urgent hedonism recently articulated in Invert Journal. What would it mean, asks Kay Gabriel, for gender to function as a source of disalienated pleasure rather than an accumulation strategy? Axiomatically, a basic condition of possibility for the collective turn-on would be communal luxury, which is to say, the manifestation of the principle everything for everyone, prison abolition, universal leisure, free abortion on demand, no borders, liberation from the wage relation, and ecological abundance. This idea of luxury communism, by the way, before it became hijacked by accelerationist visions of high-tech automation, was a term invented by some utopian vegans in Manchester, including Judy Thorne on a Tumblr, evoking forested post-proletarian cityscapes and vast free people's baths. Bath time has always been identified as a node of particular promise in gay and sexual liberation struggle, whereas now we have the private spa. Historically, public bathhouses and beaches are where the temporal discipline of getting clean has been rejected entirely in favor of the capacious, anti-functional temporality of bathing all day, bathing for bathing's sake, bathing with and in other bodies, playing all day on that Moebius strip between cleansing and contamination, knife edge between soaking and dehydration, oceanic bliss and drowning. Fighting against the policing and regulation of what Geordie Rosenberg calls our constitutive porosity means figuring out how we will manifest architecturally and ecologically biomes conducive to bathing aimlessly and celebrating our collective permeability on a mass scale. The vapor-containing techniques of masking up and keeping a 6-foot distance from one another's bodies might paradoxically prove to be wonderful popular primers, not only in solidarity and epidemiological consciousness, but also, therefore, tenderness. And as we abolish the capitalist logic of work and obligatory enjoyment, we will instantiate the conditions of possibility for the collective turn-on. We will, as survivors of the old regime of sexual violence, design whole cities full of erotic, biotic infrastructure, whole continents adorned from coast to coast with spaces of thrilling safety, mushroom glades, therapy marquees, doula grottos, patient-led free clinics, swimming holes, napping palaces, drop-in centres, temples for public weeping, bathhouses, multi-generational creches, polymorphously perverse aquifers, people's banquet halls, multi-species library sensoriums, train compartments that can get you off and laundrettes that offer to fist you, collective houses that promote well-being, dance halls that promote bliss, massage coliseums, and pleasure pavilions. We shall all have become creatures well-versed in saying, I would prefer not to, and no. The lustlessness of the pre-COVID era will become shockingly obvious to us in retrospect. We will hardly believe the historians when they tell us about the old days of Me Too and heterofatalism. Thank you.
I'm going to dive right in. As Flesh That Is. Georges Bataille's 1928 novella, History de l'Huile, Story of the Eye, is considered an erotic classic. The episodic narrative follows a pair of young people, an unnamed male narrator and Simone, his female partner, through some truly transgressive sexual antics involving, among other participants, a mentally fragile teenage girl, an onanistic English aristocrat, and a priest. It is unquestionably pornographic, yet is widely accepted as part of the European literary canon. The book's rape, strangulation, erotic enunciation, sacrilege, and remains one of the most widely recognized sexually explicit works. Bataille claimed that his childhood experiences influenced the work. His mother was suicidal and his father had syphilis. A librarian and philosopher whose aesthetics of perversity, as Angela Carter called them, won him the respect of a number of intellectuals from Jean-Paul Sartre to Michel Foucault. Bataille's influence has long breached the confines of academia. Underground author Supervert has said, "His best writings are to philosophy what fisting is to a virgin anus." When I presented Story of the Eye to a live audience in an event in Brooklyn called Sex Lit, I asked the audience which character they identified with. To me, the first-person narrator represents naivete, Simone, the act of instigation, the teenage Marcel, waifishness, Lord Edmund, voyeurism, the presence of the eye, surveillance. One woman said she didn't find any of the characters deep enough to identify with. Bataille wrote Story of the Eye in 1928. The cultural expectations of women in the West during this period were shifting. A wave of women's suffrage had recently swept across the English-speaking world and was beginning to gain ground. There is a case for a feminist reading of Simone. She is completely unhinged, but she controls the household and the terms of sexual interaction. In more academic discussions of the Story of the Eye, she is sometimes referred to as the maternal phallus. Early in Story of the Eye, the narrator describes himself as raping Simone. He's not doing anything aggressive, and she is more than welcoming of his sexual attentions. The word sticks out, not because rape is offensive and violent, it is, but because it doesn't feel accurate. In his later philosophical work, Erotism, Bataille writes of the courtesan. Her personal modesty must have had some of the shine rubbed off it, but she maintained the principle of the first contact, which requires that a woman shall be afraid of surrendering and a man shall expect the woman to try to escape. Erotism was published in 1957, almost 30 years after the first publication of Story of the Eye. Reading the two together crystallizes the context of coercion shared and committed by the narrator and Simone. Their antics stem philosophical framework that posits sex as violence, a legacy of Sadian perversion and Bataille's distaste towards the church. Writing of Sade's definition of murder as a pinnacle of erotic excitement, asserts that it only implies that the destructive element pushed to its logical conclusion does not necessarily take us out of the field of eroticism proper. The Story of the Eye, along with many other works of erotic literature, owes much to the work of Sade. Pornography, especially the more degrading works from the mainstream end of the adult industry in the early and mid-2000s, does as well. Envelope pushing was de rigueur in the gonzo genre in that era. From Ashley Blue's hardcore Girlvert series, which placed Ashley in the role of an aggressive, toxic man, to Rebecca Moore's cock destroyer branding. The trope of destruction, destroyed is often used as a search term, has become an established genre of mainstream pornography. In Erotism, Bataille also writes, "Beauty has a cardinal importance, for ugliness cannot be spoiled, and to despoil is the essence of eroticism." In the novella, the passive 16-year-old Marcel is portrayed as erotically exploited by the narrator and Simone. After an orgy with other adolescents involving broken glass and bloodletting, Marcel suffers a breakdown and eventually commits suicide. In pornography, one major career model during the VHS to DVD era was the progression from softcore performance to increasingly extreme acts. Sasha Gray famously exploded this practice by doing everything she pleased immediately upon entering the adult industry. I went a more traditional route, starting with still images, progressing to showing full-on pubic nudity or pink shots, and then edging into video before signing a contract to do scenes with male and female performers. Firsts always got a much higher interest and buzz. It was understood that they could be easily marketed and appeal to shame-driven consumers. I often got to perform an active female role. Working with a couples-oriented company that prided itself on high production values and use of narrative, I was rarely cast as a passive participant, much less reluctant. Bataille originally published Story of the Eye under the name Lord Och, which loosely equates to Lord Shit. In an essay for Le Petit, he says Lord Och is God relieving himself. I've often wondered how respectability plays into the later use of Bataille's legal name, starting with the 1967 4th edition. Does the work become more respectable under a legal name? Did the work become accepted enough for it to be associated with the rest of Bataille's writings? Or is it simply that after his death in 1962, there was no one left to insist on his pseudonym? Eyes, eggs, testicles, sons, tears, urine, semen, milk. In French, the word for eye is oil, and the word for egg is oeuf. Oeufs are a common euphemism for testicles. Roland Barthes has covered the complex circularity of Bataille's imagery so thoroughly in his essay Metaphor of the Eye that there is no point trying to be original about it. There are no grounds for saying, Barthes writes, that the metaphor sets out from the genital to end up with such apparently asexual objects as egg, eye, or sun. The imaginary world unfolded here does not have as its secret a sexual fantasy. If it did, the first thing requiring explanation would be why the erotic theme is never directly phallic. What we have here is a round phallicism. It takes many pages of sexual antics before Simone and the narrator engage in penetration. Much of their play does not require a penis or phallus of any sort. Simone sitting in a bowl of milk, for instance, or pissing from the rafters, or inserting orbs, eggs, eyes, a bull's testicles into her vagina. The condensed version of Barthes' take is that I, the narrator, is the eye, both are the egg, all three are the testicle, and the sun serves through sunlight, which can pour and stream as a binding agent between a flow of tears, urine, semen, and milk. As Barthes puts it, the world becomes blurred, properties are no longer separate. Spilling, sobbing, urinating, ejaculating form a wavy meaning, and the whole of Story of the Eye signifies in the manner of a vibration that always gives the same sound, but what sound? Bataille became an ardent Catholic in his teens and considered becoming a priest. In 1920, he turned away from the church. In the climax of the Eye, the fictional priest is enticed into drinking his own urine from a sacramental chalice before Simone asphyxiates him, gouges out his eye, and inserts it into her vagina. At first I had laughed, Bataille wrote in his philosophical treatise, Inner Experience, upon emerging from a long Christian piety, my life having dissolved with a spring-like bad faith in laughter. Read superficially, the abuse of the priest signifies anti-clerical transgression and sacrilege for their own sake. Bataille's work in erotism hints at a deeper meaning. My purpose, he writes, is to see in eroticism an aspect of man's inner life, of his religious life, if you like. By this point in the book, Simone has become a kind of saint of perversion. She is queer in her desires, which exceed the binary of heterosexuality and homosexuality, having orgiastic sex with people of all genders, being a catalyst for erotic transgression, coalescing sex and violence. In one of the final scenes, the narrator and Lord Edmund garb themselves as priests, and Simone as an angelic-looking seminarist. The main function of all taboos, Bataille writes, is to combat violence. 5 years ago, I took part in a pornographic adaptation of The Eye for 4 chambers. Mickey Maud played the unnamed narrator. Vex, a relative novice to mainstream porn, played Marcel, and I took the role of Simone, the instigator. I wanted to recreate something of Bataille's attention to sexual experience, of the way it generates the conditions for transcending taboo. Each of us had looked for a pre-existing adult production, and were surprised to find it unreferenced in its closest medium. We acted out the first few chapters, focusing on the initial party scene. During the shoot, Mickey and I joked with each other, dissolving into giggles and guffaws. We fucked on top of Vex and gradually drew her in as we entered the frenzied, sweeping dynamic of Bataille's characters. We all needed a good shower afterwards. It is an odd thing, Bataille wrote in Erotism, to be demonstrating that sexual activity, usually treated on a par with meat to be eaten as flesh that is, wields the same influence as poetry. Thank you. Thank you, Mal Magazine. Thank you, everyone watching.
Hello. I'm going to read two stories. The first one is the story that is published in Mal, and the second one is a story that's in my book that came out earlier this year, The Dominant Animal. I'm really excited to be in Mal with all of you and your fantastic work, and thank you, Maria, for inviting me. Jesus' Belt. We drove up and down a thick green road, looking for a sudden mown opening, a squatty little domicile, some ancillary structures in states of collapse. Scattered around the yard like they'd been coughed out were viable heaps of sun-beat, rain-swelled, frost-cracked objects. We stopped at one where empty detergent bottles were bundled balloon-like, skewered on rebar. An arrangement of kneeling plastic nativity lambs was dedicated to Mandy. Bright annuals grew from the bowl of a toilet that tilted on lumpy grass. An old woman came down from her porch and told us the story of her life. It took about 45 minutes. We listened, then got back in the car and continued to drive. At the next stop were several junk cars, built when being in a car felt like being in a nice little house, where surely sex was much more comfortable than it is now, though contemporary car makers claim to have our best interests in mind. In each driver's seat was a mannequin, hastily dressed in loud tourist garb, Hawaiian shirts, floppy hats. Like real men, they watched us walk among the tables. I might have read the dregs of rain and tree debris in the stacks of soup bowls and coffee cups like tea leaves if I'd known how. The dirt in the bottom of a bowl I picked up looked like a little panting dog. We brought the bowl to a shed where the proprietor sat behind a desk. Next to him was a lamp fashioned from the stiff, shiny, poorly preserved bodies of 3 juvenile alligators, one of which had a light bulb screwed down its throat, an electrical cord coming out its rear. Business cards were propped on the fixed, spindly arms of another. In the open jars of the third, a small, naked doll was wedged. I like to have fun, the proprietor said. Towards the end of the day, we turned off the road onto a long, rutted lane. We bumped along, then came to a clearing where a man sat smoking in a folding chair in front of a tidy white house. He lifted his beer in greeting when we got out. "Hey, it's Adam and Eve," the man said. "Huh?" my husband said. The man looked away. He drank his beer. On a blanket on the ground near the man was a pie crimper, a dough scraper, several pitters and stoners, a couple of corers, a slicer. Too, there were some peelers and mashers and muddlers, a nutcracker, a pot nipper, a citrus reamer. We knelt and touched them. "Adam and Eve," the man said. He jerked his thumb toward the dark forest behind his house. "You don't have to tell me," he said. "Tell you what?" said my husband. "I used to be young too," the man said. "I know all about it." He winked at my husband, then looked at me. "How much for the melon baller?" I said. "$1, the man said. He took a long gulp from his can. I handed him the bill, which he crammed into his pocket. "Out in the woods," he said, "in the grass." "Natural," the man said, nodding. "How God intended," he said. On the way back to our rental, we wondered whether the melon-baller man had murdered his wife. We passed several gruesome homemade signs pasted with pictures of aborted fetuses. It suddenly seemed clear we'd stumbled into a Bible Belt, a region of Jesus believers. Jesus' belt, we joked. If Jesus had worn a belt, it would have been a rope and a robe. Roped and robed, we laughed. It sounded like sexual violence. When we pulled up to the cabin, the thin mesh door wobbled uneasily in the breeze. We'd forgotten to lock it. Inside was a strong odor of garbage, the source of which, it turned out, was the small, ripe cantaloupe we'd left on the kitchen counter. I held it under the tap, where it felt heavy and tender, like rinsing a human head. I rubbed it dry, split it open, and scooped out the soupy seeds. With my new instrument, I popped out ball after ball and piled them neatly in a bowl. I don't like melon, my husband said after he'd swallowed some, but he ate more and I ate more, and then the bowl was empty. We sat listening to insects and birds. In another room, a clock was ticking. We must have fallen asleep. How else to explain the thick sounds like quick footfalls on the grass outside? A grand wind gusted up and began to bully the trees. It slapped the sides of the house and rattled the old unfixed panes of glass. The mesh door trembled on its latch. "Who's there?" I called. No one answered, but later, naked in bed, we heard it again. This time it came right up to the window and waited, looking in. It wanted to know why we hid beneath the sheets. It wanted to know who'd told us we were naked, anyway. In keeping with the sex-negative theme, fable. The girl's mother sent her to the store for meat, but the girl, when she arrived, could not remember which cut was requested, or even which animal. She stood with a hand resting lightly on the cool glass of the case until the butcher, a bachelor handsome to some but repulsive to others, approached, wiping his hands of the blood that accompanied his trade. "What does the young lady require?" he asked, looking at each part of her with his professional's eye. The girl was among those who found the butcher repulsive, so she turned to leave, suppressing the rise of a gag. "Perhaps," he called, "if nothing here will suit, she would like to see something else. Out back?" The girl's curiosity often led her into troublesome situations, but she considered it part of the pact her soul had made in order to gain entrance to the world, and did not worry much over what befell her. Behind the butcher's shop was a little dirt yard where a dog was tied, surrounded by many gnawed bones. Sitting on a stump of wood was a large iron skillet. "I made that," he said. "Lift it," he said. But the girl could not lift it, and she wrinkled her face in displeasure. "What good is a skillet you can't lift?" she said. The butcher frowned. He gripped the handle and swung it easily, carelessly. He thought of swinging it against the girl's head, but knew the timing was not right. The girl walked to where the dog was tied and squatted beside it. "What a pair you make," said the butcher, and indeed the picture gave him a great deal of pleasure. It rippled up and down his arms and legs, erecting the many dark hairs to be found there. To get a better look, he strode to where the girl was and gripped her by the back of the neck. He lifted her easily, carelessly. The girl limped home carrying a packet of liver, but by the time she arrived, her mother was gone. It was just as well, she thought. Her mother hated liver. The girl waited many days, but her mother did not return. She sat in a dry tub upstairs, eating crackers and thinking. Occasionally she stood to peer from the high, narrow window into the yard below, but the grass and other plants lay drab and useless as ever. She concluded that her mother must finally have found the man she'd been seeking since the departure of the girl's father on the eve of her birth. She knew her mother to be a kind woman, but one ultimately dominated by the demands of her sex, which, as she aged, became increasingly totalitarian. News of the girl's marriage to the butcher was received without surprise or comment by the people of the town. But after she'd been married a month, the girl, who really was still a girl, saw that what she'd endeavored to understand was not so complex. It wouldn't do. She rose in the night to roam the woods that edged the town, and there learned many interesting things. The sky was cold and distant and hard, but no matter. She obscured it with her smoke. Mornings before work, the butcher blackened iron and hammered it into shape on his hobbyist's anvil. He blackened the girl too, but she was less malleable than he'd hoped, so he kept her out back with the dog while he sawed bones and clasped hands in his immaculate shop, his white teeth testimony enough for any who might ask. The dog was an old gray-faced bitch. She was too old to bear pups, but she cared for the girl as best she was able. When the girl was cold, she warmed her, and when the girl was hurt, she licked the wound until it healed. But when the girl died, there was nothing to be done, and the dog sank into a silent dream. An abundance of flowers surrounded the girl at her funeral, an event well attended by the people of the town. She did not look quite dead, which eased the proceedings. To everyone's astonishment, some stranger was soon recognized. The girl's father, returned at last. How had he come to be there on that particular day? How far had he traveled? Where had he been? And what had he seen these many years? The father stood at the center of the crowd, shaking hands, his smile wide and benign. The girl's father spent what remained of the day with the butcher, who prepared a hearty meal of his choicest cuts. The two men took a quick liking to each other. As they ate, the father said, "Tell me, butcher, what was she like?" The butcher, saddened suddenly by the absence of the girl, could think of nothing to say. "She was always hungry," he pronounced at last, "and she enjoyed eating whatever was placed in front of her." When they finished, they stepped outside to admire the slow decline of the sun. They walked in a leisurely fashion, arriving finally at a little pond beloved for its middling beauty. Along its banks lay heaps of small, smooth stones, which they kneeled on to paw through. Handled properly, a good stone would jig happily, prettily, across the surface until exhausted. As the men understood it, the trick was to hold the thing lightly, tenderly, and then, with a swift jerk, send it spinning. After they'd been at it a while with some success, they paused to observe a pair of figures a little farther down the shore. "Well, would you look at that?" said the father, shading his eyes for a better view. It was the butcher's old bitch, awake now and mounted on the hind quarters of a young rascal about town, an impregnator par excellence. She gripped his neck with her teeth. Though he cried and struggled, she took her pleasure with the strength of one suddenly possessed by some fresh and vigorous spirit. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sasha Bonét, and I hope it looks a little clearer for you than it looks for me. It's a little bit pixelated. But I want to start just with a quick introduction about the difficulties of creating this particular essay. The dynamic between a writer and an editor is complicated because the essay writer seeks to serve the best interests of the writing and maintain the integrity of the argument, while shaping it into a form that fits its container, much like this journal. The editor's interest is first the life and sustainability of the magazine and its readership, and although there is overlap, the appeals of each party are not entirely aligned. And for this reason, the potential for static always hovers. But alas, the editor and the artist must agree to have cohesion on the argument. They cannot be interested in telling different stories. So, in this essay called Breaking the Curse of Black Venus, sociologist Sabrina Strings and I have ideas that overlap, and our arguments are not congruent. I'm using elements of Strings' research to illuminate my argument. As a critic and a writer, I'm analyzing the works of these Renaissance artists as I see them. Strings' research is a tool. It is not the engine of this argument. Therefore, I feel no need to stick very close to it. Creative nonfiction is exciting because there is much space for interpretation and wander on the page. The essay I will read from is a cultural criticism woven with narrative anecdotes, and my style rests largely on research-informed criticism, much like those Eula Biss, Hilton Niles, Margot Jefferson, Leslie Jamison. My qualification to tie themes and concepts together based on researched references, experience, and the untold truths about colonialism. The great trickery of colonialism is that the villains wrote the history, and therefore much of the work is unlearning and creating new narratives. This essay at its core is also about who gets to write history, so therefore this is not a generalization or any offhanded remarks or opinions that can be read as incredibly condescending and follows the very way of thinking that I'm criticizing in this essay. As this entire essay argues, for white people, evidence is rarely necessary in pursuit of the truth. There is a long history of this type of language being used when difficult racial conversations are explored, and for this reason, I expect couth. I want to be clear that I don't believe that I'm above criticism, but there is a finesse and flexibility in the editing process as it is an art of its own. The problem with racism is that it is everywhere, much like the air that surrounds me right now. It's very difficult to detect and really easily dismissed. So I won't waste my time mentioning that word here. Marginalia and passive aggression is a violent act. Since we are all professionals working with words, we all understand their power. And I would assume that any verbal passive aggression is a deliberate and conscious attack, all of which I overlooked for money. So I will start with the piece, Breaking the Curse of Black Venus. Yet this white dehumanizing endeavor has left its toll in the psychic scars and personal wounds now inscribed in the souls of Black folk. These scars and wounds are clearly etched on the canvas of Black sexuality. And that is a quote from Cornel West. The Roman goddess Venus was white. Black Venus was born later, during the High Renaissance, which coincided with the beginning of the European slave trade. Before being forced to the Americas, enslaved people were imported from Africa to ports in the northern and western Italy and in the Low Countries, the regions which were also home to some of the canonical artists of the period, Titian, Veronese, Rubens. In Fearing the Black Body, sociologist Sabrina Strings examines how the growing population of African girls and women brought to Europe as slaves, aligned with the visibility of Renaissance visual artistry, offered fertile ground for the construction of the fictionalized Black female identity, which Strings refers to as the prelude. There are many variables throughout history that alter the assumptions projected onto Black women. The only constant is the erotic. In an effort to separate their work from that of their peers by incorporating Black subjects into religious, domestic, and mythological scenes, Renaissance artists were able to water the seeds of their fabrication. I suspect that this concept is of easy virtue offered convenience for these artists to explicate their unconscionable lust for enslaved women. In their narrow imaginations, Black Venus is envisioned as the lower-ranking beauty in comparison to the enchanting white woman. She shares a similar voluptuous aesthetic to white Venus, but with a tiny tint of contempt. Unlike Botticelli's infamous Venus Pudica, who covers her pubis and breasts, Black Venus is depicted as immodest and lacking in shame. Black Venus, with her full plum-colored lips, is wholly physical rather than sacred. She was made for consumption. She belongs to everyone. Much like the meaning behind the contemporary acronym often associated with Black women, thought. The hood owns that. In Titian's reimagined version of Diana and Actaeon, the maidservant's black back and shoulders are bare, but she is only interested in preserving the purity of Diana. Veronese presents the black maidservant similarly in his biblically reimagined Judith, the head of Holofernes. She is the lookout in solidarity with Judith after the beheading of the Assyrian invading general. Her beauty is apparent, but her status is easily identifiable by her garments and skin exposure. Reinforcement of an identity is only necessary when the objective is to uphold mythical concepts, because truth, like water, will always find a way to seep out. At 10, my body shifted terrains without my consent. As flat plains became rounded peaks and deep valleys, the world around me made a sudden shift as well. At 10, I was 5'8" with fully formed breasts, while my friends still wore children's clothing. I was no longer allowed to wear my favorite denim shorts that I suddenly had to negotiate past my hips, or play outside alone, or ride my bike further than the railroad tracks. This body brought forth suspicion from my mother and aunties. When they called me fast, they didn't mean the urgency in which my body developed. How could flesh alone define deviance? I carried my body like an apology, afraid of being seen while also titillated by the novelty of this new attention. I came to represent a symbol I did not earn, grantor of masculinity. I fumbled my way through adolescence with attempts to reclaim control over my body by allowing grown men to fondle me. This is far too much power for a girl. I remember reading the memoir I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou in high school many times, and each time being struck by the account of her reaction to being sexually assaulted by her mother's boyfriend, Mr. Freeman. Even as an adult, she references him with the article of respect, Mr., a derivative of master. Initially, before being capable of processing her pain, she is thrilled with the attention and begins initiating the encounters by sitting in his lap while her mother is away at work. As a small girl, she is not yet able to differentiate tenderness from terror, only that she has the magic to make his flesh stand erect like an ear of corn. After she confesses to her mother, Mr. Freeman is murdered by her uncles. Young, bruised Maya stopped speaking for several years in hopes that men would forget that she was in the room. When you are a girl and you recognize that your only value is associated with physical elements of your being, you internalize this as your potency. Skewed formations of self-worth begin to rise on the soft spots that had yet to determine its final shape. Ego forms there, molded from the remnants of racialized fragmenting. The hardening begins. The curse then starts to infect the most intimate corners of Black life. Sarah Bartman became known as Hottentot Venus after she was taken from South Africa and brought to Europe as an ethnographic freak show attraction for white people to gaze at for amusement and scientific confirmation of Africans' lack of humanity. For one shilling, you could poke at her large, round, brown bottom. Later, she was given to the founder of the director of the Paris Museum of Natural Science, Georges Cuvier, where she was raped on the justification of science and made to bear that child that resulted from this violence. When her soul was put to rest, Cuvier dismembered her body for scientific study, of course. Bartman's labia rested in a jar of formaldehyde inside case number 33 of Musée de Léon, permanent collection in Paris until the late 1970s. As Europeans made their way to the Americas, they forged their dependence on Black women for physical and sexual labor. The institution of slavery depended on Black women's fertility for labor expansion. When it no longer served the productive interests, it was stigmatized as a burden, what Reagan popularized in the 1970s as the promiscuous welfare queen, who reproduces merely to increase the amount of government funding she receives monthly to avoid working for a living. If Didion is correct in that we tell ourselves stories in order to live, white people tell themselves stories in order to justify exploiting and killing Black people. I wonder if the enslaved women that J. Marion Sims pried open without anesthesia cried out for mercy or silenced their suffering to disempower their terrorists. The one we now call the father of modern gynecology. Maybe they stopped hollering. Maybe they were all out of breath. Maybe that's when the conclusion was made that Black women don't feel pain, because conjuring did not necessitate evidence. The concept of Black women being capable of brute strength encourages endless sexualized dependency. The most fascinating element of Steve McQueen's biographical period drama, 12 Years a Slave, is the psychoanalytic lens used to explore the tempestuous relationship between the slaver, Epps, and his slave, Patsy. He loves Patsy, and he hates her for it. He doesn't understand why he loves her. She's Black, she's filthy from harvesting 500 pounds of cotton under the summer sun without access to soap, yet he still yearns for her each night. Like an addict, he is ashamed after he has been satiated. He cries in her mouth as he lies inside of her, and she cries too. Although she has no agency over her own limbs, she embodies a mystifying power that renders him weak. The line between negrophilia and negrophobia is obscure. Black women who spend their working lives not only as mothers, but also as domestics are yet another instance of Black women penalized on 2 counts and forced into roles which are extensions of those of white women. Where the white woman is the wife, the Black woman is the mother on welfare and the bearer of future workers for the state. Where the white woman is the call girl or mistress, the Black woman is the street prostitute. Where the white woman is married to a man who can afford it, a Black woman takes over the care of the home and children for her. In short, to be a Black woman is to operate almost totally as a physical body without the inducements offered her white counterpart. While white females are sexual objects, Black women are sexual laborers. That's by Kay Lindsay from The Black Woman, an Anthology. I Googled Black porn. Tight Black girl pounded. Gang bang. Black whore punished. I Googled white porn. Beautiful blonde amateurs. When girls play. 2 kittens make sweet love. The line between negrophilia and negrophobia does not exist. Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl was one of the first autobiographical accounts to portray the sexual harassment and abuse that had been customary for enslaved women. At the age of 12, Harriet's caretaker died, and she was sold to Dr. James Norcom, who then proceeded to harass her relentlessly for sexual favors. Harriet soon met a white lawyer and began a sexual relationship with him that led to the birth of her 2 children, whom Norcom legally owned. This angered Norcom, and Jacobs felt this to be a victory. It was something to triumph over my tyrant in that small way, she says. She would eventually escape the South and travel to New York, and Norcom would continue to hunt her unceasingly. The war of my life had began, she said, and though one of God's most powerless creatures, I resolved never to be conquered again. Jacobs employs the very device that is bringing her discomfort to liberate herself. This is the perplexity and genius of destabilizing the stereotypes of your sexuality by placing yourself in control of them, much like WAP. Negress. Even the way it comes off your mouth feels erotic. The hard consonant pushes the tongue off the teeth with force, yet the ending lands softly with a sweet lingering. It wholly encompasses phonetically what it defines. Recently, I met an Austrian tourist in the Sugar Hill neighborhood of Manhattan. He was a gentle and soft-spoken man, the kind man who disarms a woman because he sings the blues. He had recently arrived in New York and approached me for recommendations for live jazz venues. 3 weeks later, we met for breakfast just before his departure. I asked him about his experience of visiting the city for the first time, and I assume he had eaten hot dogs with mustard on Broadway, but he'd participated in a much more American activity. He said he'd had sex with a Black woman for the first time and had never felt so white. He shared his revelation with me. I've always associated Black women with wild sex, but I've also been told Black women don't give head. Both weren't true, he says. My mother provided me and my brother with essential advice on how to avoid trouble. Don't ride in the car with more than one Black friend. Never loiter. If you have somewhere to be, get there briskly. A Black man should never appear as if he is without destination. Don't walk too closely behind white women, especially at night. Smile often around whites. They love a cheerful Negro. She wanted to keep alive and she wanted me to help. However, my brother was never prepared to provide solace for me. It was my responsibility to expect and predict risk, to absorb shock. She believed she and I could bend beyond our limits. I wish I could say that being intimate with a Black man felt safer than intimacy with a white man. I wish the familiarity was not a distraction from the perpetuation of harm. I wish Black men loved all Black women the way they love their mamas. In Black Looks, Race and Representation, Bell Hooks suggests that phallocentrism was born as a product of male evolution from hunter-gatherer culture to the technological age. In the latter period, male physicality is no longer necessary, leaving Black men struggling to position themselves within the matriarchal Black family structure. Within this social order, Black men are superior only when positioned on top of a Black woman, and I would always allow them to rest their entire weight on me so they could feel like men. The mythical narrative precedes our every encounter. Some of us perform the fictional for fear of being rendered invisible. Some of us imagine bringing death upon Black Venus and hope that the memory will go too. If not, the poet Audre Lorde offers many uses of the erotic, starting with internal satisfaction. We can imagine ways to love ourselves in a space fatigued by drought. And now we muse with Lorde. What shall we call ourselves now that our mother is gone? Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Yeah, brilliant. Wow, I feel like my mind's been blown away by all the readings, and I'm still churning over lots of things from that, particularly from that last reading, Sasha. So I'm going to read from my next collection, which is called All the Men I Never Married. I'm just going to read a few of those poems. And so the first one. So I started writing this. I wrote a poem about an ex-boyfriend. I thought I'll try and write a poem about all of the ex-boyfriends. And then I thought I could write any poem with a man in, could be part of this collection, which is called All the Men I Never Married. So it kind of got out of control quite quickly. So it started with ex-boyfriends, and then I just started writing poems about men that had irritated me, or I don't know, normally irritated. So this is the first where it started. So All the Men I Never Married, number 1. There was the boy who I met on the park, who tasted of humbugs and wore a mustard yellow jumper, and the kickboxer with beautiful long brown hair that he tied with a band at the nape of his neck, and the one who had a constant ear infection, so I always sat on his left, and the guy who worked in an office and could only afford to fill up his car with £2 worth of petrol, and the trumpet player I loved from the moment I saw him, dancing to the Rolling Stones, and the guy who smoked weed and got more and more paranoid, whose fingers flickered and danced when he talked, and the one whose eyes were 2 pieces of winter sky, and a music producer, long-legged and full of opinions, and more trumpet players, one who was too short and not him, one who was too thin and not him. Are you judging me yet? Are you surprised? Let me tell you of the ones I never kissed, or who never kissed me. The trombonist I went drinking with, how we lay twice a week in each other's beds like two unlit candles. We were not for each other, and in this we were wise. We were only moving through the world together for a time. There was a double bassist who stood behind me and angled the body of his bass into mine and shadowed my hands on its neck. And all I could feel was heat from his skin and the lightest breath, and even this might have been imagined. I want to say to them now, though all we are to each other is ghosts, once you were all that I thought of. When I whisper your names, it isn't a curse or a spell or a blessing. I'm not mourning your passing or calling you here. This is something harder, like walking alone in the dusk and the leaves. This is the naming of trees. This is a series of flames. This is watching you all disappear. So I should have explained that all the poems in the book and the poems that I've got published in Mel this time, they're all just numbered. So none of the men are named. It's just all the men I never married. Number 1, number 2, number 45, etc. So I'm just going to read a poem from the that's in the magazine now, which is about the fun experience of having a stalker when I was 17. Popped up on Facebook last year and tried to friend me. And of course, I didn't accept the friend request, but I did have a look at his profile first to see what he was doing. So this is All the Men I Never Married, number 3. It didn't really help, the story of Othello and Desdemona and Iago and poison in the air. And though our teacher taught us about poor Desdemona, bad Iago, Othello escaped almost blame-free, possessed by jealousy, driven into a state. So when my ex became my stalker, all the boys in class ignored me, and every lesson he looked through me until the evenings when he was drunk and in a nightclub, and then he'd ring and start to cry and try to find out where I was or where I'd been, asking why I wouldn't listen, why I'd stopped picking up the phone. Sometimes I answered it with silence, imagined him alone, listening to my nothing. That year of A-levels, I got myself a stalker, and the police said, "Aren't you flattered?" In the station there was laughter at the 40 phone calls every day for weeks. He said that I'd agreed to be with him forever, and then I'd changed my mind. What could he do but become my stalker and wait till darkness fell and slash my father's tyres or call fire engines to my house, though there was nothing catching fire? When my ex became my stalker, he convinced my mum to let him in, then locked himself inside the bathroom. It felt like I'd let him win, even though it finished with him in a police cell because of texts he'd sent with threats and words like kill and guess what happens next. And so the police kept him overnight to think about his actions and rang his mother, who had no idea how any of this happened. So there was a line in Sasha's essay about this is far too much power for a girl. I thought it was such a beautiful and haunting line. I feel like I'll be thinking about it all night, and I just wanted to read another All the Men I Never Married poem, kind of in response to that idea, or picking up on that idea of kind of discovering sexuality in a landscape of violence, I suppose. So this is All the Men I Never Married, number 7. Imagine you're me, you're 15, the summer of 95, and you're following your sister onto the log flume, where you'll sit between the legs of a stranger. At the bottom of the drop, when you've screamed and been splashed by the water, when you're about to stand up, clamber out, the man behind reaches forward, and with the back of his knuckle brushes a drop of water thigh. To be touched like that for the first time. And you are not innocent. You're 15. Something in you likes that you were chosen. It feels like power, though you are only the one who was touched, who was acted upon. To realise that someone can touch you without asking, without speaking, without knowing your name, without anybody seeing. You pretend that nothing has happened. You turn it to nothing. You learn that nothing is necessary armour you must carry with you. It was nothing. You must have imagined it. To be touched, and your parents waiting at the exit and smiling as you come out of the dark, and the moment being hardly worth telling. What am I saying? You're 15, and he is a man. Imagine being him on that rare day of summer. The bulge of car keys makes it difficult to sit, so he gives them to a bored attendant who chucks them in a box marked property. A girl balanced in the boat with hair to her waist, and he's close enough to smell the cream lifting in waves from her skin, her legs stretched out. And why should he tell himself no, hold himself back? He reaches forward, brushes your thigh with a knuckle, then gets up to go, rocking the boat as he leaves. You don't remember his face or his clothes, just the drop of water, perfectly formed on your thigh, before it's lifted up and away by his finger. You remember this lesson your whole life, that shiver of time, that moment in the sun. What am I saying? Nothing. Nothing happened. And then I'm just going to read 2 more short poems to finish off. So this is also in the magazines. This is All the Men I Never Married, number 25. It's probably one of the more light-hearted poems in the book. If I'm ever bored of monogamy, I'll come and find you. We'll go to bed and do things we would not do with any other. I will not name them here. I don't blame you for asking. I blame you for not asking sooner. I used to think you were a user. I thought I knew what a user was. I thought it was just lust, but you were the best at some things, the best that I've known. How we pretended none of it mattered. It's splendid to look back on it now. It was splendid to know you. If I'm ever bored of monogamy, I know who to turn to. And I'm just going to finish off with a poem that when it was published in the New Statesman last year, and it annoyed quite a few men, but one particular man on Twitter who said that it was calling for the annihilation of men in the same way as the Scum Manifesto, which I was dead proud of at the time. So this is just a kind of fair warning to any men that are still listening, that you might be annihilated any moment now. So I didn't even think it was one of the worst ones in the book. I thought, imagine what he's going to do when he reads the other 46. So this is Never Married, number 47. I let a man into my room because I couldn't bear the thought of him with someone else, even though he wasn't, never had been, never would be mine. I showed a man into my room as if I was selling him the space. I opened the door and let a shadow follow me inside. I didn't turn on the light. I turned on every light. I allowed a man into my room and he was kind. I let a man follow me to my room and didn't close the door in time. I let a man push past me through the door and told myself I didn't really mind. I let a man into my room which turned into a lift, and we were together, then apart, then together, then apart, depending on whether the door was open wide. I let a man into my body and let him sleep inside my room. I let him in, I let him in. I said that he could do those things, but only in my mind. I let a man into my room and took a vow of silence, took a vow of there's no turning back, because a mind is not for changing. The men inside my room do not like leaving. They think they know my name, but one of us is lying. I step across the threshold. I follow them inside. Once they're in, they're in. I open, then I close my eyes. Thank you so much. I have to give a thumbs up now to tell that I'm done. So, or wave. I meant to wave. That's what I meant to do.
So thank you so much to all of our readers this evening and to the issue contributors who couldn't be here tonight, including Diane Williams, Sam Riviere, and Wayne Kalstenbaum. You can read the full text exploring the ideas discussed this evening in the new issue of Mal, Sex Negative, which is available to order from our online store. And a selection of the pieces are also available to read online. And also, if you follow our newsletter, you'll be able to read some of our contributors' recommendations of their favourite films, art and writing on sexuality and the erotics, which is part of our Malpicks series. And finally, we're on Instagram and Twitter if you want to keep up with what we're doing. And once again, a massive thank you to all of our speakers this evening. And I hope you've all enjoyed listening to them read from the next issue of Mal. Goodbye, good evening, give a wave.